Commander AEL Versu had attended 11 memorials in her career. This was the first one held for an entire species. The gathering fleet drifted in loose formation at the edge of what used to be called the Soul Exclusion Zone, though nobody used that name anymore. It didn't need excluding. There was nothing left inside it to protect anyone from. 23 ships, representing 14 governments and one uneasy trade consortium, hung in the dark like mourners around an open grave. Their running lights were dimmed to the minimum required for collision avoidance. Nobody had ordered that. It had simply happened, ship by ship, over the 6 hours since the fleet assembled, as if light itself felt inappropriate here. AEL stood at the forward viewport of the Syndral Vantage, her hands clasped behind her back in the position her old flight instructor used to call the funeral stance. She had learned it for exactly this kind of occasion and had hoped, for most of her adult life, never to need it for something this large. Behind her, the observation deck was filling with officers from a dozen species. Chitinous Thren engineers stood in respectful silence beside the boneless, drifting forms of ossuary diplomats. A cluster of Karsa clergy had set up a small shrine near the far bulkhead, its candles, real flame, real wax, an anachronism they insisted on, the only warm light in the room. At the center of it all was the reason everyone had come, a vast, slow-collapsing brown dwarf that the old star charts still labeled, out of habit, as Sol. It didn't look like a sun anymore. It looked like a wound. Where a living star should have blazed white gold, this one pulsed a sullen ember red, its light guttering unevenly across its surface like a coal about to go out. The system's official designation had been updated 6 months ago, when the last automated buoy at the heliopause had gone silent. Sol, Class 6 collapse event. No signals detected. Presumed total loss. AEL had read the report so many times she could recite it. She still didn't fully believe it. "You're thinking about the numbers again," said a voice beside her. She didn't need to turn to know. It was Dr. Pren Yosaya, the mission's lead xenoastrophysicist, and unofficially, the closest thing the expedition had to a conscience. He was Thren four-armed and silver carapaced, with a particular stooped posture that meant he'd been awake far too long. "I'm thinking about the numbers," AEL admitted. 11 billion Pren. That's the last confirmed population estimate before the blackout started. "The population estimate is 8 years old," Pren said gently. "It could have grown. It could have shrunk. We don't know. We know enough." Aile's voice was flatter than she intended. "We know there was a colony fleet in transit to the Kessa Reach that never arrived. We know Earth's last transmission was a distress beacon that cut off mid-sentence. We know that thing," she nodded toward the dying ember of a star, "started its collapse sequence 11 months ago, and nothing, not one signal, not one dry flare, not one distress call, has come out of that system since. So we hold a memorial," Pren said. "And then we go home and tell our governments it's over. That's the plan." AEL didn't like the plan. She had voted against sending only a memorial fleet, had argued for one more search pass, one more sweep with long-range gravitic sensors before anyone started lighting funeral candles. She had lost that argument. The consortium wanted closure, not cost. 11 months of silence from an entire species was, in the language of budget committees, conclusive. She hated that word, conclusive, as if grief could be filed and closed like a shipping manifest. Pren didn't answer right away. He was watching the ember-red star with the particular stillness of someone doing math he didn't want to finish out loud. "Say it," AEL told him. "I keep thinking about the transmission logs," he said. "The last 11 months. Every automated buoy in the outer system went dark in sequence, moving inward, like a wave. Every one of them stopped broadcasting at almost exactly the moment the star's mass loss curve should have reached it. It's a very clean pattern, Commander. Nature is rarely that clean. You think someone shut them down. I think the universe doesn't usually collapse a star in a way that's convenient for the instruments watching it," Pren said. "But I've run that thought past 3 separate review boards over the last year, and every one of them told me I was reaching for a conspiracy because I didn't want to accept a tragedy. Maybe they were right. Grief makes people look for patterns that aren't there. Or it makes people stop looking for patterns that are," AEL said. Neither of them had an answer for that. Around them, the observation deck continued to fill. More officers, more diplomats. The low murmur of 24 species finding their places for a ceremony none of them had wanted to attend and none of them could avoid. A soft chime sounded through the observation deck, the signal that the formal ceremony was about to begin. AEL straightened. Around her, the assembled officers and diplomats and clergy fell into rough rows, facing the viewport, facing the dying red ember that had once warmed a species into existence. The Karsu High Cleric, a slight being wrapped in ceremonial gray cloth, moved to stand at the front. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the strange resonant quality of a species that sang more than it talked. "We gather," she began, "not because we knew them well. Few of us here ever stood on their world. Few of us shared their air, their gravity, their strange short lives that burned so fast and so bright. We gather because we watch them from a distance, and because in watching we came to admire something in them we did not expect to admire." AEL closed her eyes. She thought of the recordings, decades of first contact archives, trade negotiations, the astonishing, reckless speed with which humanity had gone from a single fragile world to 100 fragile colonies in the span of one alien lifetime. She thought of the arguments in the consortium chambers. Half the delegates convinced humans were a danger to themselves and everyone around them. The other half insisting that danger was indistinguishable from the thing that made them remarkable. They were told, many times, that they moved too fast, the cleric continued, that they reached before they were ready, that the void does not forgive haste. And in the end, perhaps, the void proved them right. Somewhere behind AEL, a Thren engineer made a low sound of grief, a mechanical click word that AEL had learned, over years of service alongside them, meant something like a sob. "So we light this fire," the cleric said, gesturing to the candles, "not for a world we lost, but for the shape a world leaves behind when it goes. We commit their memory, too." The proximity alarm cut her off. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even especially urgent sounding. At first, a soft double chime. The kind that usually meant a debris fragment had drifted too close to the formation. Ailes' head turned toward the tactical station out of pure habit, expecting nothing. Then the chime repeated, faster, insistent. "Report," AEL said, and her funeral stance dissolved instantly into the posture of a commander. The tactical officer, a young ossuary named Ket, was already hunched over her console, her boneless form rippling with the particular agitation her species showed under stress. "Commander, I'm reading a contact. Point of origin." She stopped, looked up, looked back down, as if checking the numbers wouldn't change them. "Ket, point of origin is inside the collapse zone, Commander. It's coming from a star." The observation deck went utterly silent. Even the cleric had stopped mid-sentence, one hand still raised toward the candles. "That's not possible," Pren said, but he was already moving toward the science station, for arms working 3 separate readouts at once. "Nothing survives inside a Class 6 collapse field. The gravitic shear alone would." "I know what it should do," Ket snapped, an uncharacteristic edge in her usually placid voice. "I'm telling you what my sensors are showing. Something crossed the collapse boundary 11 seconds ago. It's small. It's fast. And Commander," she hesitated. "Say it," AEL said. "It's decelerating. On its own power. Something is flying that thing." For a long moment, nobody on the observation deck moved. 23 ships' worth of officers and diplomats and clergy stood frozen around the viewport, staring at a point of light that had, impossibly, just been born from the heart of a dead star. AEL felt something she hadn't felt in 11 months of writing reports about a presumed extinction. Hope, sharp and unwelcome and terrifying, because hope was so much easier to lose than certainty. "Get me a visual," she said. Now, the image that resolved on the main display 11 minutes later did not look like anything that belonged in the vacuum of space. It was unmistakably a raft, not a ship, not a shuttle, not an escape pod, not anything built with intention from a shipyard. It was a flat, ungainly assemblage of scavenged hull plating, roughly rectangular, lashed together with what the enhanced imaging suggested was actual physical cable, magnetic clamps, structural adhesive, and in at least 3 visible places, what looked like knotted rope. A single sputtering thruster, clearly cannibalized from something much larger, was crudely mounted at one end, firing in short, controlled bursts that were, against every expectation, actually working to bleed off its velocity. "That is not a spacecraft," Pren said, staring at the display with something between horror and awe. "That is a pallet. A pallet moving away from a stellar collapse event at 11% of light speed," Ket said. "Was moving. It's decelerating. Whoever's flying it knows exactly what they're doing." "Whoever," AEL repeated. "Life signs." Ket's readouts flickered, resolved, flickered again as the ship's sensors struggled with interference from the dying star behind the raft. Then steady. 1. Humanoid. "Vital signs are," she paused again, and this time it wasn't hesitation, it was disbelief. "Vital signs are strong, Commander. Elevated heart rate, consistent with physical exertion, but strong." "Alive," AEL said, and the word came out of her like something she'd been holding underwater. "Alive," Ket confirmed. The observation deck erupted, not into chaos. The discipline of a memorial fleet held even under this, but into a low, rolling wave of sound, gasps and whispered exclamations in a dozen languages, the Karsu clergy breaking into a ragged, joyful hymn that had moments before been a dirge. Pren had both of his upper hands pressed to the sides of his head, a Thren gesture of overwhelm AEL had seen exactly twice before in her career. "Commander." Ket's voice cut through the noise, tight and controlled in a way that pulled every head on the deck back toward her station. "Before you give that order, the object trajectory isn't stable. It's tumbling on its long axis. Whoever's flying it is fighting for every degree of control they've got, and they're losing ground. At current rate, structural integrity fails in approximately 6 minutes." The joy on the observation deck curdled instantly into something colder. 6 minutes, Pren repeated. "Maybe less," Ket said. "The thruster's cycling erratically. I think it's overheating. If it seizes, there's no backup. That thing has no redundancy, Commander. It's not a ship. It's not even really a vessel. It's a person strapped to some scrap metal, and the only thing standing between them and vacuum is a single engine that was never built to do what it's doing." AEL felt the funeral stance she'd only just abandoned threaten to reassert itself, the terrible, familiar posture of watching something end and being unable to stop it. She pushed the feeling down. "Helm, close the distance. Maximum safe burn. I don't care about elegant approach vectors. I care about minutes. Ket, get that tractor beam calibrated for an object that's tumbling. I want to lock the second we're in range, not a second after. Pren, if that hull fails before we reach it, I want to know immediately. And I want to know if there's anything we can do about it from here." "There isn't," Pren said quietly. "Not at this range. Commander, I want to be honest with you. If that thruster fails before we close the gap, there is nothing this ship or any ship in this fleet can do." "Then we close the gap faster," AEL said, and turned back to the viewport, where the small, stubborn light of the raft continued its ragged, tumbling burn against the dark, refusing, second by second, to go out. The next 4 minutes passed in a silence unlike any AEL had experienced in her career, not the reverent quiet of the interrupted memorial, but something taut and electric. 24 species holding a collective breath around a single flickering point of light. She watched the tactical plot update in real time. Distance closing. The raft's tumble growing more pronounced as its thruster fought a losing battle against forces it was never designed to resist. 2 minutes to tractor range, Ket said. Thruster output is dropping. Whoever's flying it knows it's failing. They're making micro adjustments, trying to buy time. It's good flying, Commander. It's very good flying for something that shouldn't be flyable at all. 90 seconds, Ket said, a moment later. Then 60. Commander, thruster output just spiked. I think that's the last of it. They're burning everything they've got left. Lock the instant it's in range, AEL said. Don't wait for a clean solution. Take whatever you can get. 30 seconds. 20. Ket's hands moved in a blur across her console. 15. The thruster died. AEL saw it on the display before Ket said anything. the small flare of light at the raft's stern simply winking out, leaving the whole ungainly assembly tumbling free, silent, dark, at the mercy of momentum alone. Tractor lock. Ket's voice cracked with relief. I have a lock, Commander. Contact secured. I have it. It's not going anywhere. The observation deck exhaled as one. AEL allowed herself exactly one long breath before she was moving again. Bring it aboard, she said. Match its deceleration curve. Get it into the hangar bay. And I want a full medical team standing by the moment those doors open. Ket, hail it, all frequencies, all known human protocols. Tell them we see them. Transmitting, Ket said. Her boneless fingers, if fingers was the right word, moved across the console with sudden, fierce focus. Commander, I'm not getting a response on comms. Whatever's out there, either their transmitter's damaged or they're too busy flying a scrap metal raft out of a collapsing star to answer the phone, AEL said. Keep hailing. Pren, get me everything you can on that collapse field. I want to know how anything crossed it, and I want to know now, because if there's one human alive down there, there may be more, and I am not leaving the system until I know. Pren didn't answer immediately. He was staring at his own console, his four hands still, his silver carapace unnaturally pale under the deck lighting. Pren. Commander, he said slowly, the collapse field. I've been running passive scans on it for the last 11 months, as part of the mission brief, cataloging the decay pattern for the historical record. He turned to face her fully. It's not decaying the way it should. What does that mean? It means a genuine Class 6 stellar collapse follows a predictable curve. Mass sheds at a specific rate. Gravitic distortion increases in a specific pattern. The whole process is, frankly, boring to watch because physics doesn't get creative. He gestured at his readouts. This star has been pretending to collapse for 11 months. The mass loss curve is inconsistent. There are gravitic anomalies that look less like natural stellar decay and more like, he stopped. Like what, Pren? Like something is generating them artificially, on purpose, as camouflage. The observation deck, which had been awash of joyful noise moments before, went quiet again. But this was a different kind of quiet. AEL felt the shape of an idea take hold in the room before anyone said it aloud, because everyone standing there had spent 11 months believing the same thing, and none of them wanted to be the one who said it might have been wrong. You're telling me, AEL said carefully, that the collapse of an entire star system might have been staged. I'm telling you the data doesn't fit a natural model. Pren said. I've been telling myself for 11 months that I was misreading instrument drift. I don't think I was misreading it anymore. AEL looked back at the main display, at the improbable little raft, still burning, its scavenged thruster in careful, disciplined bursts, closing the gap between itself and a fleet that had gathered to bury it. Get that tractor lock, she said. I want that raft in our hangar bay in 20 minutes. And I want to talk to whoever's on it before we do anything else. Everyone else, stand down from memorial posture. We're not here to bury anyone tonight. The raft came apart the moment the tractor beam took its weight, not violently, but with the particular exhausted collapse of something that had been holding itself together purely through effort and had finally been allowed to stop. Hull plates that had been straining against their lashings for however many hours or days sagged inward. The scavenged thruster sputtered once more and died, its fuel finally, mercifully spent. The figure lashed to its center did not come apart. She held on through the whole slow, jarring process of being drawn into the Syndrel Vantage's hangar bay, one arm hooked through a loop of cable, the other pressed flat against the raft surface, as if she could steady 11 billion souls' worth of grief through sheer force of will. When the bay doors sealed and atmosphere began to cycle in, she let go. AEL was there when the medical team reached her, close enough to see the woman's face before the visor of her patched, ancient-looking suit was carefully removed. She was young. Human ages were notoriously difficult to read, but AEL would have guessed no older than 30 in Earth years, with cropped dark hair plastered to her skull with sweat, and eyes that, even now, even after whatever she had just survived, were sharp and assessing, cataloging the alien faces around her with the specific, wary calculation of someone deciding how much danger she was in. Name, AEL said, crouching down to the woman's level, keeping her voice low and even. Can you tell me your name? The woman's throat worked. Her voice, when it came, was cracked and raw, but steady. "Chief Petty Officer Reyes," she said. "Naomi Reyes, Confederated Earth Fleet." She looked past AEL at the assembled medical team. The hangar bay, the unmistakable silhouettes of alien ships visible through the bay's transparent upper hull. Something that might have been relief, or might have been grim satisfaction, crossed her face. "You got our signal, then." AEL went very still. "What signal?" Reyes blinked, slow and heavy with exhaustion, and for a moment AEL thought she might lose consciousness before she answered. Then she focused, dragging herself back from the edge of it through what looked like pure stubbornness. "The recall beacon," she said. "We've been broadcasting it for 6 weeks. Figured somebody'd finally pick it up." A humorless, exhausted laugh. "Guess we cut it a little close." "Officer Reyes," AEL said carefully, "we have received no signal from this system in 11 months. We came here because we believed your civilization had been destroyed. We were holding a memorial when your raft crossed the collapse boundary." Reyes stared at her. For the first time since the medical team had reached her, something in her controlled, exhausted composure cracked. Not into grief, but into something sharper. Disbelief, quickly curdling into anger. "A memorial," she repeated. "Yes. You thought we were dead. We had no evidence to the contrary." Reyes let her head fall back against the deck, staring up at the hangar bay ceiling, and laughed. A real laugh this time, ragged and disbelieving and edged with something that sounded almost like fury. 11 months, she said. 11 months we've been running silent, feeding you a fake collapse signature, buying time, and the whole time you people were sitting out here writing our eulogy." "You faked it," Pren said from behind AL, his voice hushed. He had followed the medical team down, unable to stay away. The collapse. It was deliberate. Of course it was deliberate. Reyes pushed herself up onto her elbows, waving off a medic's attempt to keep her still. "You think Sol just decided to die on a schedule that happened to be convenient for us? We staged the whole thing. Mass ejection patterns, gravitic distortion, the works. Took 18 months of prep and about every resource we had left after the war." "What war?" AL said quietly. Reyes's expression shuddered. "That's a longer conversation than I've got air for right now. Then give us the short version." Reyes studied her for a long moment. AL had the distinct sense of being weighed, measured, judged against some private, human calculus of trust. Whatever the woman decided, it seemed to land in AL's favor, because she spoke. 18 months ago, something came through the edge of our system. Not one of you. A glance around the hangar bay, at the alien faces watching her. Something else. Something none of our sensors had a match for, and something that opened fire the second it got in range. No hail, no warning, nothing. We lost the Kessa Reach Colony fleet in the first exchange. 11 billion people on Earth and every colony we had left, and we had exactly one thing going for us. "What was that?" Pren asked. "Nobody outside our system knew we were still here to defend," Reyes said. "So we made sure nobody found out different. We faked the collapse, went dark, pulled every ship we had left back to defensive positions, and we spent the last 11 months rebuilding in the one place in this galaxy nobody was watching anymore, because everybody assumed we were already gone." Her mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Turns out being underestimated is a hell of a strategic advantage, if you're willing to let people grieve you to get it." The hangar bay was silent. AEL thought of the memorial, of the curse of him, of 11 months of reports stamped conclusive, and felt something complicated turn over in her chest. Grief for a species that hadn't needed it, mixed with something closer to shame. "You let us believe you were dead," she said. "For 11 months. You could have signaled us. Asked for help. Could we?" Reyes's eyes were hard now, all exhaustion burned away by something colder and more focused. "You people spent the last decade arguing in your councils about whether humans were too dangerous to leave alone. I've read the transcripts, some of them got leaked before the war. Half your consortium wanted us contained. You think we were going to broadcast our exact position and force level to a coalition that couldn't even agree amongst yourselves whether we deserve to exist?" Nobody answered her. AL found she had no answer to give. So we went quiet, Reyes continued, and we built, and we watched. And when we were ready, we sent out the recall beacon on a frequency we knew our own scattered fleet would recognize and nobody else would think twice about, buried inside what looked like background stellar noise from a dying star. She managed, somehow, a thin, exhausted smile. I was supposed to link up with our forward scout group 2 systems, over. My drive failed 4 hours out from the rendezvous point. This, she gestured weakly at the wreckage of the raft, visible through the hangar's inner viewport, was what I had left to work with. Figured I'd rather die trying to reach somebody than sit in a dead ship waiting for my air to run out. You rode a stellar collapse field on a raft made of scrap metal, AEL said, because you'd rather die moving than die waiting. When you put it like that, it sounds a lot more dramatic than it felt, Reyes said. Mostly, it just felt like the only option that wasn't giving up. AEL studied her for a moment, the exhaustion carved into every line of her face, the careful, guarded way she still held herself even now, safe, warm, surrounded by people who had just spent 6 hours proving they weren't a threat. It was the posture of someone who had learned, recently and thoroughly, that safety was never a guarantee, only a temporary condition that could be revoked without warning. You said your drive failed 4 hours out from the rendezvous, AEL said. Tell me about that. What happened? Something in Reyes's expression shifted. Not fear, exactly, but the particular careful blankness of someone deciding how much of a wound to show a stranger. Coolant line ruptured, she said. Old ship. Everything we've got left is old, patched, held together with more improvisation than engineering at this point. We lost most of our shipyards in the first month of the war, and the ones we've got left are running on scavenged parts and spite. Line ruptured. Backup line ruptured about 6 minutes. Later because it was drawing off the same feed nobody thought to isolate. By the time I got the reactor into safe shutdown, I had about 40 minutes of life support left, and a ship that wasn't going anywhere under its own power ever again. And the raft. Wasn't planned. There wasn't a plan for this. Nobody plans for their ship to die 4 hours from the only friendly waypoint in 100 light years. I had 40 minutes, a dead ship, a suit rated for maybe 6 hours if I didn't move much, and a stellar collapse field close enough that its gravity was already pulling debris toward it. Reyes's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. So I did the math on it. If I stayed with the ship, I had 40 minutes and then nothing. If I strip what I could off the hull and let the collapse field's gravity do the work of accelerating me, I had a chance, a bad one, but a chance, of using the field itself to get somewhere instead of nowhere. Wasn't really a choice. One option was definitely dying. The other one was probably dying, with slightly better odds. You used the collapse field's gravity, Pren said slowly, as a slingshot, through the field itself. That's Officer Reyes. Do you understand how many things had to go correctly for that not to kill you instantly? I had a lot of time to run the numbers, Reyes said. 40 minutes and after that. However many hours it took building the raft. Turns out fear's a pretty good motivator for doing math fast. She shrugged, a small, tired motion. Didn't get it perfect. Lost the primary thruster about 2/3 of the way through. That's the one you people caught before it seized entirely. If your ship hadn't been sitting exactly where it was, holding exactly the position it was holding, I don't think we're having this conversation. You mean the Memorial Fleet, AEL said quietly. The one gathered to mourn you. Yeah. Reyes looked at her, and for a moment the guardedness cracked into something raw, something that looked almost like disbelief at her own survival. The one gathered to mourn me. Funny thing to owe your life to. Nobody on the observation deck spoke for a moment. Ket had gone still at her station. Even Pren, usually quick with a question, said nothing. I want to ask you something else, AEL said finally. And I want you to understand I'm not asking as an interrogator. I'm asking because 11 months from now, I don't want to be standing in front of another dying star wondering if I misread the truth again. The hostile force. The one that attacked your colony fleet. Do you have any indication, any at all, of where it came from or where it might be now? Reyes was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice had lost some of its exhausted humor. Our best intelligence, and it's not much, puts its origin somewhere beyond the Kessel reach. further out than any of your charted territory. Nobody got a good look at its drive signature before it opened fire, but the survivors who made it back described something that didn't behave like anything we'd cataloged. No hail, no warning shot, no attempt at communication of any kind, not before, not during, not after. It came in, it started firing, and when our defense grid actually managed to land a few hits, it didn't retreat like something protecting itself. It just adjusted and kept coming, like the losses didn't register as losses. She looked up, meeting Aile's eyes squarely. That's the part that scares me more than the guns. Something that doesn't flinch. When you hurt, it isn't fighting a war. It's running a process. And processes don't stop until somebody makes them. The observation deck was very quiet. We don't know where it is now, Reyes finished. We know it's out there. We know it hasn't found what it's looking for yet, or we'd probably already be dead. And we know that whatever we build in the meantime, we're building on borrowed time, same as everybody else in this region, whether they know it yet or not. It took 6 hours for the full picture to assemble. 6 hours of careful questioning, of cross-referencing Reyes's account against sensor logs and archived intelligence, of the Syndrovantage's command staff slowly, uneasily coming to terms with the fact that everything they had believed for the better part of a year had been, if not a lie, then a performance staged for an audience that had never questioned its own front-row seat. AEL stood again at the forward viewport, this time with Pren and Ket beside her and Reyes, cleaned up, fed, wrapped in a thermal blanket she'd initially refused and then, exhaustion winning out, accepted. Seated in a chair someone had brought up from a medical bay, watching the dying ember of a star that was, they now knew, not truly dying at all. The unknown hostile, AEL said. You still don't know what it was. No, Reyes admitted. Didn't have long enough to get a good look before it started shooting. Some of our people who survived the first engagement described something that didn't match anything in our records. And believe me, we compared notes with every species we'd made contact with before the war started. Nobody had a match either. Then it's still out there, Pren said. Almost certainly. Reyes pulled the thermal blanket tighter around her shoulders, and for the first time since her rescue, something like fear showed openly on her face, not for herself, AEL thought, but for what came next. Which is the other reason we needed to stay hidden as long as we could. We weren't ready to fight it again. We're still not really. But we're a lot less ready to die than we were 18 months ago. AEL was quiet for a long moment, turning the pieces over. A species presumed extinct that had, in fact, spent 11 months rebuilding in secret behind the smoke of its own fake funeral. A hostile force capable of shattering a colony fleet with no warning, unknown to every cataloged species in the region. A recall beacon that had, by pure chance and a failed engine, delivered exactly one human into the hands of the coalition that had come to mourn her people, and had instead found them very much alive, and very much not asking for permission to exist. Officer Reyes, AEL said finally, what happens now? From your side. Reyes looked at her, really looked, the wariness from the hangar bay still present, but tempered now by something that might cautiously have been the beginning of trust. Now, she said, you go back to your consortium and you tell them the truth. That we're alive. That we're rebuilding. That whatever's out there that tried to wipe us out is still a threat to every system in this region, not just ours, because it didn't ask our permission before it opened fire, and it sure as hell won't ask yours. She managed a tired, humorless smile. And you tell them that if they want to argue again about whether humanity is too dangerous to leave alone, they might want to reconsider what happens to civilizations that get left alone anyway, and build something worth surviving with. That's not really an answer to my question, AEL said, and found, to her own surprise, that she was almost smiling. No, Reyes agreed. But it's the only one I've got the energy for right now. Behind them, on the main display, the false dying ember of soul pulsed on, patient and deliberate, a star performing its own death, so the people sheltering behind it could live long enough to choose their own second beginning. Somewhere beyond the collapse field's carefully staged edge, an entire species was quietly rebuilding itself out of the wreckage of a war nobody else had known was being fought, not asking to be saved, not waiting to be found, simply refusing, with the same stubborn, reckless momentum that had first carried them off their homeworld. to stay dead just because it would have been easier for everyone else if they had. AEL thought about the memorial candles, still burning somewhere down on the Karsa shrine, lit for a species that had never needed mourning, only time. Ket, she said, send a priority signal to the Consortium Council. Tell them to cancel the memorial designation on the Sol system. And tell them what instead, Commander? AEL looked out at the false dying star, and at the raft's wreckage still visible through the hangar's inner viewport, patched and lashed and impossible and there, and thought that for the first time in 11 months, she finally had a report worth writing. Tell them, she said, that humanity sends its regrets for the premature funeral, and that they should probably start clearing calendar space, because from the sound of it, humanity's not finished yet. Beside her, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of scorched metal and vacuum seal adhesive, Naomi Reyes closed her eyes and, for the first time in 6 weeks, allowed herself to sleep. While Reyes slept, the fleet did not rest. Word of what had happened at the edge of the Sol system moved through the Coalition's communication networks faster than any official channel could contain it. A memorial fleet that had come to mourn an extinction and found, instead, a survivor riding a dying star's own gravity like a wave. By the time AEL sat down for her conference with the rest of the command staff, half the delegations had already drafted preliminary statements, and none of the drafts agreed with each other. Some called a triumph, proof that humanity's stubbornness, so often treated as a liability in consortium debates, had turned out to be exactly the trait that let a single officer survive the impossible. Others were less generous, framing 11 months of deliberate silence as a betrayal of the trust the Coalition had extended, an act that raised more questions about humanity's judgment than it answered. AEL listened to both arguments cycle through the conference for the better part of 3 hours and found herself, more than once, thinking not of policy or precedent, but of a raft tumbling free in the dark, its thruster dying, its single occupant refusing, even then, to stop making the adjustments that might buy one more second of control. She thought that was probably the only argument that mattered. In the end, everything else was commentary. She woke 11 hours later in the Syndra Vantage's medical bay, in a bed built for a species roughly her size and shape, under a blanket someone had thoughtfully swapped for one that didn't smell like scorched metal. For a moment, in the disorientation of waking, she forgot where she was, and her hand went instinctively to the cable loop that had kept her tethered to the raft for 6 days, until she found empty air instead, and remembered. Pren was in the room when she woke, seated in a low chair beside the bed, her hands occupied with a data slate that he set aside the moment her eyes opened. "You're safe," he said, before she could ask. "The Syndra Vantage is holding position at the edge of what used to be the exclusion zone. Commander AEL Versu is in conference with the rest of the fleet's command staff. She asked me to sit with you until you woke, in case you needed anything, or in case you woke up in a strange room full of strangers and reached for a weapon out of habit." A small, careful smile. Thren are considered fairly non-threatening as first faces to see under those circumstances. Statistically, Reyes managed a rough laugh. "Statistically, I have run the numbers," Pren said, with the particular seriousness of someone who had genuinely run the numbers. She pushed herself upright, testing the ache in her shoulders. 6 days lashed to a scrap metal raft had left bruises she suspected would take weeks to fully fade. "How long was I out?" 11 hours. The medical staff wanted longer, but I imagine you've spent enough of your life being told what to do by systems that didn't ask your opinion first, so I'll simply tell you what they recommended and let you decide. Pren hesitated, an oddly human gesture on an alien face. "For what it's worth, Officer Reyes, I want to apologize. Not on behalf of the fleet, though I suspect that apology is coming through official channels eventually."